Following on from the FyneConf 2020 live code presentation, I wanted to share the complete notes project from the very beginning to a finished app. Anyhow, so we will be going absolutely from scratch. So first of all, I'm going to make a folder for this application and we'll open that in Visual Studio Code. I don't really know VS Code particularly well, so I'm not going to be using keyboard shortcuts. Hopefully that makes it easier to follow, but please excuse me if it's a little bit clunky getting around. The terminal is going to be pretty handy, so I'll bring that up there. And from there, we will want to make sure that we've got Fyne installed. But let's also make sure it's the latest version. So if you have Go, then the Go command is available. If not, then check your path variables and so forth, but it should be readily available. Go get is for installing packages, -u for upgrade, and it's fyne.io/fyne is going to install the library. And right away, you're seeing a strange message here, which you won't get at your end. This is because I have some Fyne code that I'm working on at this end, and it doesn't think that they're quite the same. That won't be a problem. Just pretend that didn't happen. So to get started, we'll add a new file, and in traditional fashion, we'll just call it main.go for our main file. Because we're building an executable here, we will call it package main as well, and give it a function. And if we save that file, everything's good. This will build a Go executable, but it won't do anything. In fact, you can see here, done. So it built and ran, but it didn't run much. To make this into a Fyne application, we need to set up the library and run an application instance. So we can do this at .new, and it should. So you could see it's found the Fyne library from Fyne.io, and it's realized that this app package is where that's coming from. And the app package is going to do all the magic things like picking the driver, the graphics, and all those things that make your application work across all of the different platforms. Like I said, this is going to be building a properly cross-platform application, so you shouldn't have to do any configuration at all. The single letter variable is not something that I do very often, but because we're always creating an app and then a window, it's almost like, I don't know, C for counters and L for loops. So I just drop this here. It stays in the main function, it won't be an issue. We do a.new window, and every window wants a title. So we have created a window. Now, before we get on with the application, let's just round this out and see that it runs. So a window needs some content, and let's just load our very first widget. New label. If we just save that, it will pull in the import there. So all of the Fyne widgets are in a separate package. It means that once the import is there, you can see all of the widgets, and a couple of letters there will help narrow down the search. And once we have set the content, we need to show the window and run the application. Now, that's a bit much to type every time, so we have a little helper, show and run. And then if we do the same thing and run it again, there, we have our very first Fyne application. That's the content and the title of the window that we specified. Cool. So let's build something just a little bit more interesting. In fact, let's flesh out the basics of a notes application. And for this, I didn't manage to draw a diagram, but I think we can imagine what it's going to be like. We've got a list of notes down one side, the content is displayed on the other. Let's put a toolbar at the top for some add remove functionality like that. And for the most part, I think the rest of the UI should respond as you'd expect. Just yeah, edit what's there, save automatically. Shouldn't be too much more to add than that. So let's just create a quick new function called load UI. So that's just an easy way to separate building of our user interface from the main function, which I find to be helpful. And we don't know what the user interface is going to comprise, but every single Fine graphical object is a canvas object. So we can return a canvas object. It couldn't autocomplete that because it's another import. There we go. So at the top level of the Fine project, we have standard interfaces defined. So you can tell what an application is using the top level interface, but to invoke it, use the app package. Similarly, a canvas object is defined at the top level as anything that provides all of this functionality. But really, we're going to be using the widget package to create fully functional objects for our canvas. So we're probably going to use a new split container, I think, from 1.3 that will allow us to separate the list on the left to the content on the right. So new split container on the horizontal axis, and so we need to pass it two items, the left and the right hand content. So let's say on the left, I was about to say list, but there's going to be more there, so maybe side. And then our main content, I'll just call content, nice and easy. So what are these going to be? Well, I think the content is pretty straightforward. We'll just make it a multi-line entry. There we go. Now the sidebar, it wants to be a list of all of our notes with a toolbar at the top. So the list is pretty straightforward again. Let's use a VBox. So that's a vertical aligned box where all of the items are as small as they can be in the vertical alignment, but equally wide on the horizontal. That's super helpful to get things up and running, but the way it shrinks can be a little bit confusing to some folk. I think it worked here. And then we need a toolbar. Let's just call it bar. New toolbar. So we could just leave it there, but let's put some things in the toolbar. So the toolbar is comprised of toolbar items, I think. Yeah, it takes a list of toolbar items. So new toolbar. So these are all different toolbar items: spacers, separators, actions. We want an action. So this is like it's a button, something that you can tap on, and that takes a resource, which is the icon, the illustration, and then the activated function. So for this, we'll use another package again. We'll use the theme package, which provides the standard icons and colors. That's imported there. We'll use the content add icon. And for now, we'll just have an empty function when you tap it. And we can do the same again for remove. So, oh, excuse me. Ah, yeah, it fixed the ordering there as well. I was about to worry. So we have our list and our bar, but we don't have side. So something to contain both of those is going to be a container, which is something that's defined at the top level because it's very generic. It's a container is like a canvas object, but it contains multiple child elements, so they can be laid out, arranged, all sorts of things. A widget is kind of an interactive container, but this time we're just using it to lay out. In fact, we'll pass a layout. If we don't pass one, then things could be moved around manually with move and resize calls, but this time we want it to be handled for us. So one more package. This should be the last one we need to set up the user interface. That didn't load. It'll come up in a minute. A new border layout. I'm just saving as we go here so it points out the errors quicker. I think it's easier to follow. So a border layout takes 4 parameters, the top, bottom, left and right items that will be positioned against the borders, and everything else is in the main list that will be centered in the remaining space. So we want to put our toolbar at the top, so that's top, and the rest are going to be nil. And then we will list the bar and list, I think I called it. Yeah, there we go. Maybe this font's just a little bit too large now. Let's pop it down a couple of notches. Great. Of course, I could just expand that. So we've pretty much got the bones of it here, I think. But our list looks a little bit bare. So before we run it, let's just pop a couple of labels in here as well. Item 1, and let's be really imaginative. Item 2. If we save that and run, yeah, I hope somebody spotted that obvious mistake there, definitely on purpose. We need to set the content to the result of our load UI call, or it's not going to be able to load. And there we have our first user interface. It's got the notes, it's got a toolbar. The buttons aren't doing anything, but they're there. And this content is all there, and we have the interactions that you'd expect from an editor. Cool. I think the bar should be sort of over here though, so let's just tweak that. Instead of returning this container directly, let's set up a property on that. So we'll save a reference and put the offset to 0.25, so that's 1/4, and then return the container again. And if we expand, there you go, that feels a little bit better. So I suppose we might want to do something when these buttons are clicked first of all. Let's just do that. So we made labels here, but labels aren't tappable. You could, I suppose, extend a label object. It's something that Fine allows you to do, but it wouldn't look tappable even if you made it tappable. So let's put a button in instead. Because a button looks tappable, so it should be more obvious. And a button takes a function handler, just like the toolbar action. So really we want to set the text of our content. Let's just copy that value over for now. We'll come back to that. But our content was defined down here. So for now, we can just reorder our code. It will get tidied up as we go along, don't worry. So there we can set the content. And if we just do the same again for our second item, missing my commas, item 2, there and there. New button. I didn't really mean to do that either. Hope you're keeping an eye. So now these look a little bit more enticing to tap, I think. And we could action that one or that one. Not a huge addition in functionality, because if we then edit, it's not going to do anything yet. But before we do that, I think it's important to track what note we're displaying. Otherwise things are going to get confusing. So before we move on with the user interface side of things, let's define a new type called note. Again, in the main package. So type note is struct, and it has a content. What else does a note have? I guess it has a title, but I don't want to set the title separately, so let's derive the title from the content. So we could ask for a function there. That's the other place where single letter variable names seem reasonable. The scope is pretty clear. But before I write this, let's just start putting a test in as well, because another one of those myths, I think, is that graphical user interfaces are hard to test, or impossible. I've heard some people say. You know who you are. So let's start adding tests almost from the beginning. I know we didn't test the setup code there, but really we were just getting things running, and it's not showing much desired functionality yet, so I think we'll get away with it. Now again, let's package main. So you could also use main underscore test for your package, so that you're separating your production code from your test code. Means that you're going to be testing the public API, but we're building an application here, so I think testing our own code internally is enough. We're not really exposing an API to any third parties. So let's write our first test. Test note title. And we'll want to pass in the appropriate scope for line test. So here we can see VS Code's obviously realized what we're doing. It's offered some helpful suggestions for running tests later, but it doesn't do anything yet. So we will create a new note with content hello, and I think it should clearly be titled hello. It's pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to use a little assert package called Testify, which I find really helpful. It's not essential. If you want to use a different one, that's fine. If you want to use the built-in tools, they're okay as well. But this is just, I don't know, a little bit easier to read. We want to make sure that the title is hello, so we'll call my note.title. And now if we test, we'll see a fail because, oh, for one thing, our code doesn't compile. Not the best way, but they say get a failing test and then fix it. So let's fix the compilation error and then see the test failure. I'm using snippets of test-driven development here, but I don't think I'm particularly strict in following it. It's pretty helpful, so I pick what seems appropriate. And then in this instance, we could just return content. Probably not going to suit most cases. The note content. I wonder if this is going to run for us. There we go. So that worked. However, the point of it was so that we could figure out the title. Let's call it the first line of text, I think should probably be the title. Line 2. So really, we want this new instance of my note, which has this content over 2 lines, to return note. And there, it didn't, because we've got 2 lines of output. So let's add a little bit of logic to this. So let us split using some string utils. So split, not after n, let's split n. We could split the string on all new lines, but in this case, we only really care about the first one. So let's split on new line and only have, 2 items in the output, and then return the first item. So if we have 2 lines, it will return the first line, I hope. There, excellent. Now, I have my tester's hat on just now, so let's just be a little bit mean to ourselves here. The content is empty. Well, I'm going to say that we probably don't just want an empty piece of an empty title on our list there, or you'd have an empty button. It wouldn't really make too much sense. So I want untitled to come back if we don't have any content in our note, which is clearly not coded. So I like to put early exit cases at the top. So if content is the empty string, return untitled. And I'm sure there must be a rerun button, but I can't find it. One of those keyboard shortcuts I'm sure that I'll learn over time. There we go, that's all passing. That's pretty cool. So now that we know what a note is, let's go back to our user interface and actually use that knowledge. So this was a statically built list. Let's load the UI based off an actual list. I should just call it list. It's easy enough. And make a list of notes. Where the first one, what's going on here? Note 1, content 1, don't really need that space, and note 2. Not really very imaginative on the dummy content here. So we'll pass that in to load UI, which isn't expecting it. So let's make sure that we say so up here. So notes is a list of note, or a slice, sorry. Well, there's not too much Go specific in here for anybody. I find it so easy to pick this language up, I sort of forget that it's not necessarily trivial. With a C background, it's all too familiar. So instead of setting up this VBox statically, we'll make that list and then range over the notes that we have passed in. So we don't need the index n in the notes list. Then we will just append what we had before. Don't need the comma. New button. So the title of the button is going to be the title of our note. And when it actions, we want to set the text to the note content. So that's completely reasonable looking, but there is a little catch here. Because we're in a function, Go is going to range over this variable and always execute the last value. So we need to capture this note. And so actually need to make sure that we're setting the right content. And that should be us. Note 1, another note. Cool. Now, before we move on more, we've set a note, but it would be nice if we could indicate which one was loaded. So I'm going to just pop a global variable in here. Sorry about this. So the current note will store that, and I suspect that we might set the current note from a couple of different places. And so what we should do is set the content, of course, but also set the current note this note. But content's not defined out here. So just for now, another global variable. Come back and fix this too. Widget. Now the widgets are types, so we'll just put a pointer there. Content. And that's just the note that we've passed in. Okay, so also when we're loading here in load UI, we could also show the top note. So if we have one, then let's just set the note to be the top of the list. What did I do? I haven't set, this happens a little bit too much for my liking. So we have a global variable, which I said we'll fix, but we've made a local one here. So we need to set our global variable. Catches me out all the time. There we go. So now the content is note 1's content, and then we can switch between them. But let's show which is current as well. So when we're setting these up in the list here, we need to set a hint on this button. So the button is as it was. I did not mean to do that. And then if the current note is, or rather if the note that we're adding is the same as the current note, and we can add a little hint. Set the style. Primary button. So I mean, we're sort of using functionality there not exactly as it was intended. Really, a list widget would work very nicely, but we don't have one available to us yet. So there we go. It shows us this is note 1. Now, if we tap, it's not going to refresh, but we can fix that when we're adding and removing instead. So why not? Let's just move on. Now, I said that I would tidy this up, and I really should now. So as the interface becomes a bit broader, then you probably want a type that can encapsulate all of the state, and we can then attach the functions to it instead. So I'll just call it UI. And then we can move our variables into there, so they're not global anymore, which really makes me feel much better. This is all going to break because we need to attach it to the state, so let's just do that. And we're using the UI content, and we're setting the current node in the UI. And load UI, we could set this up just kind of the same if we make the state at the top. Oops. And current can be nil. That's fine. Content, well, we could just pass that right in. I will call setNote on our user interface there and there. We'll check whether it's current here. And the content is what we passed into the user interface state, so there we go. And the rest of the code should work as it did before. So that's pretty much the same as before, but it's tidied up. We don't have the global state. In fact, we don't even have a global user interface object at the moment because load UI is just taking care of it for us, so we didn't need to know about it out here, which makes me feel a little bit better. So next, let's you know what, let's fix that refresh issue whilst we're here. Now, to update the list when something changes, we're going to want to hold the state for that as well. So we'll just make a new variable here called list. It's not VBox here, it's just box. So VBox and HBox are just constructors for the box widget that sets up the state. As you can see, horizontal is just a parameter there. So then the list would be set into the user interface list, like that. And then we need to do that. And again, user interface list here. So that's moved the variable declaration out to there. And this means that we can refresh it when we need to. So we could reuse the objects, we could scan through what's there and make the changes, which if we're being really performant about it, that might be the way to go. But in this instance, I think that we could just take this code and run it each time. So if we made a new thing called refresh list, popped it on our UI type like this. So we're building we don't need to build a new VBox each time. Let's set up the list and then refresh it. So instead of building a new one each time, list, we want to set it to have no content, and then we can add to it later. And notes, we need to pass that in as well. So let's, for now, just pass this note list around like we were doing before. So refresh list takes the list of notes to refresh. And in that instance, we can then refresh the list. We're going to need the note list here. So that's probably going to just be passing it around a bit too much. So instead of doing that, let's pop the note state into our struct as well. That makes sense. In fact, if we reorder it a little bit, then we can say what our current note and our note list are, separate to what the user interface components are. So there, the note list is in the user interface. That doesn't go to there, and we pass that. We could write a constructor for this as well. But that form makes it easy enough. We'll refresh the list after we've set which note is visible. So let's crash again. That is because 26, we crashed here. The list wasn't set up, obviously. We're setting the note before we've created the list. That's not very helpful, is it? So let's just move that up to here. In fact, we could streamline that a little bit more. Pop the list in there. That should work just fine. So now when we click a note, it refreshes the list. Excellent. It's going to be super helpful in a minute when we add a new note. So, note test, note. I can't help but feel that it would be nice to have a little bit of testing going on here. Yeah. So instead of returning a canvas object from load UI, we could set up the user interface here with the notes so that we're only passing in the state for the application, which is probably what's the right thing to do, and then this load UI is going to do the rest of the lifting. So we'll do that. Let's give this a better variable name here. We're out of the scope of it and it's going to be a bit confusing. So that's making sense there. We don't need to pass that state in anymore because it's part of this object. But we do need to put this into the scope of the type. Hey, E. Dalvard, thanks for joining us. I hope this is going okay for folk. It's like I said, it's the first time I've streamed this stuff. It's a bit all over the place, but I think we're getting there. So this time we're not going to be making the UI in here because we have the scope. So we will instead be setting these UI components into it. So the content is that multi-line entry and the list is the VBox. We don't need that quote anymore. Set content notes UI, load UI. Load UI doesn't take that parameter either. I thought something was missing. So here we're going to access the notes from the scope instead. I think that is everything. So we've got that information stored up here. Let's just double check that's still running. Usually I would prefer to run the tests first and then look at the application next, but we haven't really written UI tests yet. That's what that little refactor was for. If I was being strict about it, yeah, I probably should have written the test first that demonstrated the need for the refactor. Just having a bit of fun with it, right? Package main, and here we're going to, well, we could test that the buttons show one for each note, and we could test that the content changes when you tap the button. That seems like a reasonable start. Test UI list. It's a bit generic, but should suffice. And so now you can see why I made that type. So we can random new variable there. So we're going to pass it a notes list. So we'll have note here, content is on, and let's put another one in there for 2. And what have I done there? There we go. Yep, now this just isn't. So you can see why setting it up separately, passing in the state initially so that we don't have to worry about the UI is helpful. So then load UI. We don't actually care about what it's returning in this instance because the GUI object is holding reference to the things that we're going to test. So now let us assert that we have 2 items in the list. So we want 2 items in the list, which is GUI.list children. So we've loaded the UI with 2 notes. So the number of items in that list should be 2. I think I forgot to load our test helpers. Let's try that again. Cool. So I probably should explain that. What we're doing here is we're essentially running an application in memory. We're not showing anything at all. This load UI is loading the application UI, but we're not presenting it. So what we're doing here is asking the state of the user interface. And if we don't have a driver loaded, it's going to fail with some of the lookups there. So this test package that we've made available is just basically providing an in-memory application instance that you can use to run your test against. There's all sorts of useful utilities in that package. So sometimes it will be imported directly. You won't need this underscore, which is to say we're not using it, but load it anyway. Like you might do with the PNG image encoder, just having it loaded provides functionality. In fact, let's use one of those utilities before we move on. So test UI list, and we'll extend. We'll call this one tap set content. Yeah. So I mean, this isn't particularly rocket science kind of stuff, but hopefully it shows how user interface testing can be done pretty easily. So the assert this time is going to be that the content changes when we tap. So first of all, we've made it part of our design that the top item in the list is shown when we load the UI. So let's test that first. So content should be 1, I guess. So that would be GUI.content. The text is the content that we're checking against. And whilst we're here, let us make the action that we're going to test. So here, I'm going to use those test utilities that were implicitly imported there because it's got a really helpful tap. So if we then pass the lists, the button at the top, we know there's a list of buttons in there, so we can call that. To tap it, we're going to have to say that it's a widget dot button, just because you can't tap any canvas object. So there, it's saying that that doesn't match. but we know that it's a button. So let's say that it is. So we're tapping the button, and then we want to assert that the content of the text has changed to be 2. We could just test that they're not equal, but let's test exactly what it's become. Oh. Aha. Well, it won't help if we tap the button that is the top one in the list. We need to tap the next one down the list. That was a bit of a silly moment there for me, sorry. Excellent. So we now know that the functionality that we built is working correctly. Put it the other way around and you're going to be able to use these tests to define that the functionality of your app that you're building is passing or failing if these tests are derived from criteria that are built. And we could also extract that into a new function that returns a new UI instance. It just means that there's less duplication. In fact, we need to save a reference to it, don't we? So that was almost a bit of a mistake. And now we've got quite a few tests, so let's just test that everything is running like it should. Excellent. I have high confidence now. So add remove. Let's see if we could do this quickly and then move on to persisting of data. I really hope that with a bit more time we'd get through it. I hoped an hour would be enough, but a couple of technical issues and a bit of chat meant that maybe we're running behind slightly. Sorry. So let's add the kind of the types, the skeleton to this. Let's build it with the types first. I could put this in a new file, but actually, just for now, note list. Let's pop it in the same file. They're pretty closely related. So the note list is really just a list of notes, but I would like a type so that we can pass it around and attach functionality to it like we've done above. So the list is really just a straightforward note list. No bother there. And we can access them using that field. Yeah, that should be everything. I was about to write a constructor, but I think we all know how those look. So instead, let me just start with the add. So if we have a note list type, we can create an add function on it, which is going to put a new note in the list. In fact, why not leave the business logic up to determining what a new note looks like? Our add will just return the note as well. Not yet. So in note tests, test note list add. So this time we need a new note list. So note list, which takes a list of notes. Actually, you know what? We're adding. We don't need a note list in there at all. It is just, in fact, we don't need that. It's just an empty note list. It's empty, pretty straightforward. And if we call, so list.add, we want to assert that it makes the list one long, I suppose. T1 list.list. Oh, I don't like that. Repetition is a bit of a bad sign, in especially in Go. Let's be a little bit more clear about our intent there. Notes, lists, and the one is not going to be equal to the list, is it? It's going to be equal to the length Now, if we run this, oh, it's not even going to work because I forgot to pass in the test. Try that again. I think I might have been running a bit long here. I'm overheating. I don't know about the computer if you can hear it. It's having fun encoding everything. So there we go. It hasn't added an item because we didn't tell it to. So this time let's add a new item. So first let's make a new note. Empty. Well, let's just make an empty note for now. And then we don't really want to append it. I think we want it at the top of the list when it comes in. So let's prepend it instead. So if we were appending, then the list would be like this, and we would pass the list the new note, but we're prepending, so we need to turn it around. We'll put the list at the end, the note at the top. Now, this top item needs to be a list, so we'll make it a list of one item, and then we need to make that the Varargs version, so that should prepend the note to the list and return run test. Cool, excellent. Now I guess an empty note is good enough to go with. We know that it's working, so let's go back to our UI tests. I'm going to write a test for this. So what's this one called? Test UI list. Actually, just test at UI add. Let's pop it there. Naming is a difficult one. I think if people just kind of are happy with the way that it's set up for them, that's grand. Being consistent is way more important than having exactly the right naming to go. Oh hey, thanks for joining us, Marinka. Glad you could make it. Hope you didn't miss too much. If you've got any questions, just ask them in the chat anyway, and I'll fill in the blanks. But we're getting there. I'll be sure to run the app shortly just to show you where we've got to. But we're currently adding a new note when the user taps on the plus button, but we haven't seen it. I'm writing the test first. So again, let's create another test GUI in memory using this test package is running the app for us, so that's pretty helpful. And then we're going to want to tap the toolbar. We actually haven't exposed tapping the toolbar functionality. So if I was to tab this out, add note, for example, equal. So we have here that the children list of notes is too long because our test GUI there is loading 2 notes. So we want to know actually that there's 3 now. That's not even going to compile, unfortunately. Oh, doubly not going to compile. But here we don't have add note. Now I could expose the toolbar and we could test it by tapping through. But in this instance, that feels just a little bit dirty. So instead, let's create the add note function so that we can more easily test it. If we do that, then our user interface is going to ask the notes list to add. We need to come back to that in a moment as well. That is our test compiling, so that's a good start. We need to use a note list instead of a list of notes, if you see what I mean. So that note list means that this code here is compiling, and we just need to update this. So our notes list we need the list of notes from our note list. And again here, this one, you could write a helper function, in fact, that just grab the nth item from your list, but we don't need it right now. And the notes list needs to be a new note list. And we're passing the list of, setting the list of notes to this list that we made here. In fact, it might be nicer if we created the type out here and then just passed the list in there. It's a bit neater. So now we have add note functionality, which is calling notes add. It's just a little bit of encapsulation there so that in our toolbar action we can just call add note and we don't have to expose that toolbar action to our test. So now we can run this test. Oh, not quite. Where have I missed something? Ah, yes. So this needs to be a note list as well. Oh. Or rather, it needs to be encapsulated in a note list. Constructors would probably help this to look a little bit less dense, but I think for now the meaning is reasonably clear. Failed. Expected 3 but got 2. So we added a note, but we didn't get the updated list of children. So the app doesn't work and we've not even run it. Well, when we've added notes, what we really want to do is set the new note to be our selected note, I would think. So set note to be new note, and new note is what's returned from the notes function. By spell, that would work a lot easier. Now let's just quickly go back to our test, and I think this should be the last one we need to look at. That's working. So onto the terminal. We have our note list. If I tap add, untitled, there we go. So this is untitled because we determined if the note has no content, we'll return the title untitled. Now, if I type something, it's not going to do much. So now that we know which note we're editing, that should be pretty straightforward. Let us go to our content. So when the content changes, we want to do something. So onChanged is going to want a function. This is a little different to the others because it has a content passed to it. So it's like passing the latest value. And it's not used. Oh, what's wrong there? Sorry, it's not a function call. It's setting the field. So when that changes, we want to make sure that our current item updates. So u.current content equals content. Yeah, seems straightforward enough. Probably should have written a test for that as well, really. Oh. Where's that coming from? Update tags. What obvious thing did I do wrong? Unchanged. So this is going to call whether it's a user-based change or whether it's a system change. So it's possible that we haven't actually selected our note when that happens. I think that's what's going on. So if current is nil, return. Like I said before, I like to exit early. So we could have just popped that inside the if, but I think it's clearer if you read it down this way that we're wanting to set the content and that a nil current note is the error case. There we go. All right, so interesting. That was a bit strange. I really should have written the test first. Current content equals the content of this. So let's call that after set note. I think that's what's going on. In fact, yeah, just there. So the user interface loads, and then we hook up our change listeners. No, it still didn't fix it. So the content is changing on the old current. That must be because this was triggering it. And we didn't have the current set. So now we set the current note. And so when the content changes programmatically, it's not going to overwrite the note that was previously current. A little bit of a brain melt there, but there we go. And if we add another one, it's not refreshed, but it's working. See how it didn't refresh there? So really, we need to do something a bit smarter here. For now, we can just call refresh list. That's going to make sure that our titles update whenever our content does. So note 2, there we go. I think that's working as you'd expect. Just realized I'm resizing this all of the time. Let's just fix that whilst we're here. So we can ask the window resizes. So the reason that we're passing in a new size here, which is part of the Fine API, is because the geometry is not pixel specific. It's a scaled vector-based toolkit, and so 200 by 300 might be the number of pixels on some screens, but for example here I'm on a high DPI screen, so it's going to be way out, and if you've got user scaling as well, everything needs to be bigger, but these numbers need to remain consistent. So these are like device independent pixels from Android, I suppose. Anyhow, if we run that now, we've got a user interface that's a little bit more sensibly sized. We can add a new note and call it note 3. Wow, I feel like that's success. We have an application there, it's running. We could probably add that delete button. In fact, let's just do that. And then a bit of a treat for making sure that we can save. Let's just quickly add the remove functionality. So this time we need to have a note in our note list. In fact, probably want to know which note we're removing. To remove. So we're going to put one item into there, ask it to make that list of notes as the content of the note list, and this time we are going to, well, for sanity's sake, let's just check there's one there, and then we're going to remove, check that we have 0, but we haven't written this, so it won't compile. We're not going to return anything this time. If the list's length is 0, let's not try and remove it. Return. Sorry. And then we're going to want to see what's in the list, and if we are that item, remove it. So this one of the constructs I'm not really a fan of. We need the counter and the note from the range of notes list. And if the note is equal to the note that we want to remove, in fact, let's just reverse that. Like I said, let's exit early from this loop. Sorry, from this iteration. So we do want to remove this one. Now, you're basically removing from the list. So l.list equals, again, we're appending to remove. We're going up to the ith element, that is up to this element, which is non-inclusive on the right hand side, and appending it to I plus 1 onwards. So we're removing this item. What am I doing here? There we go. We need to make that the Varrock's version of the slice. However, I plus 1 might just be an index out of bounds. So if I is the length of the list, then we actually want to do something different, and that is just to say that equals the list up to this element and not inclusive. Oops. Oh, no, that goes out there. We're getting the length of the list and taking it off. So if there's one item, then if we're 0, then we have to be the last one. Yeah, okay, so that should work. Our note test here might just work. Test note list remove is passing. Now let's just make sure that my little catch there is going to work for the last item, but also the not last item. So so the first note and second. So we want to make sure there's 2. We want to remove the first one, which is not the one at the end of the list. Make sure that 1 remains, and then we'll remove the other one. So we'll do that. Cool. Then we'll test, because we should, what the remove button does. So we've got 2 items. We want to make sure that the top one is going to go away. So we're going to remove current note. We'll check that there is 1 left. We're going to just have to quickly build this function as well. Remove alphabetically comes after. Refresh. So remove current note is going to sort of do the opposite of this then. So we're going to get the list and ask it to not the list, sorry, the notes, remove the current item, and then we will what do we set the text to? I think it's time to extract this piece of functionality here. Is that the one that I mean? No. I feel like it's been running for a while, so let's just, for now, if we have any notes left, then set to the 0, 1 and refresh the list as well. So our test for tapping remove, that's passing. That needs to be called from our toolbar, which is pretty straightforward. Remove current note. Okay, and now if we run this, we removed one note. There we go. Add my note, and then remove another. Wow, okay, cool. So the only thing left now is that the content isn't saving. Now, okay, so it's actually pretty straightforward to save content because Fine is providing a preferences API that's going to be able to store, you know, a simple key value store. I was thinking there, oh, should I break? Should we do another stream? I feel like this is too exciting a reveal, so I'm going to try and march through. And then I will put it to one side and pick up another thing next time. Or maybe, if there's some suggestions, next stream could be adding some shiny functionality onto this Notes app. Okay, so let's go for it. This might be a case of popping the code in, maybe without the tests up front. I feel like we've done the test process. We've seen how you can test the logic and you can test the user interface. This time, let's just put some code in and then we'll be seeing the app complete. Obviously, I don't do that if I'm working on something for other people, and if I've got more than 1 or 2 hours to build a complete app top to bottom. So we have here the note list being constructed. So the key really is to provide our note list with a way of persisting its data. So here we're passing in a note list, but really we don't want to do that at all. What we want to do is pass in, well, I mean, we want to load the data instead. So let's list, oh, caps. Let's just call an imaginary thing called load notes. It's going to need the context to work with. So I'm going to call this thing prefs. It's short for preferences, obviously, but I've been typing quite a lot today. So where are we going to get this from? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We have a preferences store, like I said, provided by the application. So if we go to note list and then say we want to have one of them, like many other, sorry, don't know why I jumped there. Like a lot of other interfaces, they're defined in the Fine package, and if we hover here, you can see we've got access for standard types. There's no complex type in there at the moment, no compound struct-based lookups, but we could construct something pretty substantial with just the primitive types. I'm highly confident that we'll manage that. And we want a new function that's going to load the list. And that is called load notes, I guess. We could return the list that it's going to load, but in this instance we're working on note list type, which has its own store, so let's assume that that's going to work just fine. So in our main, we're just calling it into load notes, so that's pretty much there. We don't have any notes now, so we need to first time load with nothing there. You could put obviously some dummy content. The place would probably be here. If load notes return nothing, you could have a tutorial or a dummy, a couple of notes returned. But let's just do the basics. So we want to load a list of things, and the preferences don't really have a list type. It's just basic values. So we need to use keys for the note. The values will be the content. We're going to have to know how many notes there are. So let's start. So the total is going to be int, and that's going to be note count. So you saw there possibly there's an int with fallback as well. So if you wanted a default value, you could pass it there. But because our default value is 0, then Go is going to do the right thing for us and just provide the 0 fallback. So we could just say int. And we're going to grab this note count for the total. And let's just say equals 0, return. Here, I'll just put a to-do in there. Now I have a funny idea about where we might pick up next time. Anyway, if we do have some notes to load, then let's do that. So for 0 is less than total. Is this really the first time we've used an incrementer for loop in this app? That seems bizarre. So we need to look up our preferences based on a key. Now we need to construct that key to be unique. So let's do a bit of string formatting there. Sprint F. So we're going to print the format. Note count was the initial key, so note, let's just call it note, and then the value, and we'll pass it I. So the notes are going to be numbered 0 through to total, and then the content is going to be string, and look, we're just passing it the key, and that's going to pull the content from our preferences. So then our note list append and a new note with that content. That's pretty cool. Now here you could construct a list and pass it at the end after appending them all, but again, like I said before, I don't think we're in a particularly speed sensitive situation. We're loading from a key value store and presenting the user interface. It's going to be milliseconds maximum, so I'm not too worried about that. And I mean, that's loading the notes. It's populating the list of notes in our notes list, and it's being called by our main function. So that's probably all there is. But it's not going to be much use without something stored. So let's call save notes as well. Let's just write that now. Wow, I hope that loading seemed as straightforward to you as it did to me. I'm just sort of thinking that is persistence for our note store across any platform you run this application on. A few lines of code. We should have added a test, obviously, but we're nearly there. Load notes. So save notes is going to do essentially the opposite. Now, we're going to want to make sure that we use the same key. So this is a good chance to pull some constants out. This one, let's call it note count key equals there, and then notes key format. I think that's probably reasonable. So that one there is account key, and that is the note key format. Just had a flashback there. Oh, an amazing tech movie just flashed into my mind. Shooting Fish, I think it was. They were running some fantastic cons. Raising money for an orphanage, I think, was the premise, but they were doing some pretty fun cons. One of them was a really futuristic computer, and key format files, I think, were part of it. Check it out if you've got a few spare hours and you can find it somewhere on the web. Anyhow, so now we're going to want to do basically the opposite. So the last thing we do, I'll just write it down because it's nice and straightforward, is to say how many notes we had. So we're going to set int. We're going to use the note count key, and we're just going to set that to the length of the list of notes. That's pretty straightforward. But before we do that, let's just make sure that we save the notes into the preferences as well. I think this is probably going to be just a little bit easier because we do need the index, but we can range over the notes. So we need the index of the note, the content of the note, but we can just range on notes. I'll dot list of notes. Okay, some naming here maybe I could have done better now that I look at it, but I think it's pretty straightforward for the most part. We'll get the key. Now, I'm going to shamelessly copy and paste this piece of code. It's one line. I'm not going to feel too bad about it, but I think Uncle Bob, Robert C. Martin, is in the back of my head going, you'll have to refactor that later, so promise, but maybe after I've taken a break and had some food. Now that we have the key, we will just set string to use the key. So the key is the name of the store we're using, or the value, it's naming the area that we're going to write the value into, and the value is really content. Sorry, my fingers are all over the keyboard today. So that should be all that's necessary to save. We're getting the saving key for each note, writing the content of the note, and then saying how many there were as we exit. So next time we run, we start with how many and we work through the list. That should be pretty straightforward. There's probably some safety checking to be done here, but because it's just strings and ints, the defaults of 0 are going to come back quite sensibly, and so if it turns out we've got the number wrong or we didn't save something correctly, we should get sensible blank default, which then in our note list would be untitled on the button. Anyhow, so that is the code. Now, we've loaded the notes here before the UI starts, but we need to make sure that we save the notes as well. So one thing to do would be to make sure that we save when the content of a note changes. So here, notes, save notes. Probably this gets factored out into some sort of note changed function that could be used from multiple places. I don't really like having so much in a little function, a little handler for a widget there, but it'll work okay just now. And the other time that we need to save the notes is when the number of notes changes, if we add or remove one. So if we've removed one, let's just pop that in there. And if we don't need to do it there because that's just changing what's shown, but if we add one, we need to do that as well. Now, set note is obviously calling from here into there, and you'll see that refresh list is very close to save notes a lot of times. So there's obviously a bit of organizational change we could do here, but I think that remains fairly readable. Yeah, I mean, maybe this load UI method is bigger than I would normally like. Probably splitting this out to make toolbar, so you could just pass it in here would, ease things up a little. And like I said, this change handler could be factored out as well. But I think we've got pretty readable code. So I'm going to just keep my fingers crossed here. I hope that you are as well. I just want to make clear I don't have like a screen full of notes over here. I'm not looking at dummy code or anything. We've just coded this from scratch. I may have, run through the code once before. Like I said, the presentation that I tried last week, we ran short on time, so I had an idea of the direction. Now we have loaded, we've got a functioning app like we thought, but it's a really good idea to keep a note of the errors that might be appearing in the console. If I was to close this and come back again, we haven't actually managed to persist our data. And the reason is quite clearly put here. When we used the preferences code, we didn't have a unique ID set. Now that is a step that needs to be taken before you use some of the persistence functionality and some other advanced pieces. The list is, I'm not bothered going through it just now, but the warning will come up if you're doing something you shouldn't. So we need a new app with ID so that the framework can actually figure out where to save anything. So this has to be globally unique. So reverse DNS notation is a pretty good one, a good approach here. So my domain name is andy.xyz. So here xyz, Andy, and then the application name goes here. If you have a suite of applications, you might choose to add something more here, but that should be enough for us. So with that one change, let's run this again. And if we'd written the tests first, then this would have come up. We would have seen that the persistence wasn't working, so we wouldn't have had to have loaded the app and seen that happening and been sad. So note 1 has lines, note 2, yay. So we've got note 1, note 2, and this is where I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Note 1, note 2, in the order that we had them before. This is a happy moment, a happy moment. So there we go. We have our Notes app. It's loaded. We've got our UI presented. We've got some pretty decent business logic. We've tested almost top to bottom. Another 15 minutes, and I think that we would have got almost complete test coverage on this application.